Hi, guys. Welcome to the How I Raised It podcast, the show where you get an inside, unfiltered look at how real entrepreneurs raise capital for their businesses. I'm your host, Nathan Beckert, and today's episode is with Dan Shapiro of Glowforge. Glowforge makes a 3D laser printer that cuts, engraves, and scores various materials so you can make really cool projects at home or at school. Dan is a repeat founder, so we cover a lot of ground, including why it's a mistake to ask for intros, when to play the CEO card, tips for building relationships at events, and much more. If you're tuning into this podcast to learn how to raise capital for your business, I've created a super valuable free welcome package for you. It includes a list of 2,500 investors who don't require a warm intro, plus 200 questions that investors are going to ask you. So it's really going to help you get ready to raise money. To get instant access to this, please click the link in the first comment. While you're there, please leave us a nice comment what you like about this episode or this show in general. Last but not least, if you enjoy this conversation and think someone else would too, please share it with them and hit that subscribe button to get all our latest episodes. Thank you. Now sit back, enjoy this chat with Dan.
Welcome to How I Raised It, the podcast that goes behind the scenes with entrepreneurs who've raised capital. We uncover the tips, tricks, and techniques they use to get investors to write a check. Strap in and turn it up.
Hi, welcome to another episode of How I Raised It, produced by FounderSuite.com. Today I have Dan Shapiro of Glowforge coming to us from his basement in Seattle. How's your day going?
It's going great, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right into it. What is Glowforge?
So at Glowforge, we make the Glowforge 3D laser printer, which is this amazing device that lets you push a button and bring things into the world made of leather, wood, acrylic, cardboard, paper, fabric, even chocolate. So it uses a laser the width of a human hair to carve and engrave and cut things from beautiful raw materials. And it's really like having a little bit of magic in your home. So you can push a button and bring just about any design to life. My kids have used it since they were in kindergarten. It's easy enough that you can just draw something and have it scan it and turn it into artwork. And we have researchers using it, engineers using it in professional fabrication, manufacturing lines using it to create things. And we're in over 4,000 schools, K through 12. So it really is technology that scales and brings something into your life that just hasn't existed before, the ability to create things at the push of a button.
So what's the form factor it sounds like you can load in a block of wood and it etches away, or is it where you're loading in plastic pellets and it's layering on top?
So it uses subtractive technology. Traditional 3D printing is additive. It, like you mentioned, builds up layer upon layer. But you actually just open the lid and you put in a sheet of material, and it can be anything from like brightly colored sticker material all the way up through boards or slate coasters. Like you could make things out of stone. This is a cheese board, a slate cheese board I picked up at the store. You can engrave to make a gift, and then you can cut and engrave things. Like I took a antique map of the city of Seattle and engraved this piece of leather with it when the pandemic started. So I had a mouse pad at home, and you can see it's got lots of wear and rings and everything else. But it took me about 5 minutes to put it together, grab a picture, drag and drop, draw a square around it, put the piece of leather in there, hit the print button, and then you have something really wonderful that you can keep and share, or even really practical stuff like I needed a doorstop, so. Instead of spending $7 in 2 days on Amazon, I spent 17 cents and spent 2 minutes to print a doorstop.
And so that started with a block of wood, and the laser just...
Yeah, it started with a sheet of plywood, and the laser went and cut all the different pieces. I was just for fun, I was playing around with engraving a penny. So I made a 3D map of a penny, and then it actually varies the power so it can sculpt a height map onto a piece of walnut as, like a wooden nickel, but this is a wooden penny. And so it's really neat. It lets you take those sort of creative ideas or really practical problems that you might have and very quickly go from idea to product. Exactly as you say, subtractive, by putting in the raw materials, and then it carves away anything that isn't needed.
Interesting. And what was the genesis story or backstory on this? How'd you come up with the idea, and why'd you start this business?
So this is company number 4. And all the companies sort of link together. So I'm going to have to give you the long answer, but I'll try and make it quick. So I My first startup was a company originally called Ontella, then called PhotoBucket. We basically hosted photos in the cloud and synced them off of your phone back in the pre-iPhone days. So you take a picture with your Motorola Razr and boop, it appeared on the internet. Ran that for about 4 years, stepped aside, and it's still kind of running today, but never quite took off. But that was a venture-backed company, raised a bunch of money, went for the stars, and didn't quite get there. Started a second company after I left called SparkBuy, which was comparison shopping for consumer electronics. That company existed for exactly 6 months. On our 6-month anniversary, Google acquired us. And so spent a couple of years working in the belly of the beast. I was on the ads team at Google doing work on a comparison shopping product. And then I took a leave of absence to write a book about startups. It's called Hot Seat, the Startup CEO Guidebook, and share some of what I'd learned, and to do a purely passion project, no business goals behind it. My twins, who were 4 at the time, invented a game with me. It's called Robot Turtles, and it teaches preschoolers basic principles of programming. And so I had a ton of fun with this, and I was hearing about this new thing called crowdfunding. And I'd raised angel investment and I'd raised venture investment, but I did not know what this Kickstarter thing was about. So put it up on Kickstarter, and it turned into the most backed board game in Kickstarter history at the time. So one-person operation, made and shipped 25,000 of these things, and then licensed it to a board game company who's still selling it today. They're great board game business. And so you can go on Amazon now and pick up Robot Turtles. They usually carry it in Target around the holidays, so you might find it in local specialty retailers. And it was really fun. And in the process of prototyping for Robot Turtles, I stumbled on this backwater technology from the 70s. CNC laser cutter engraver technology. These things were developed way back when, and the whole global market for CNC lasers in 2014, when we founded the company, was $100 million. The whole global market was $100 million. So nobody was investing in R&D. The lasers in 2015 looked just like the lasers from the 1970s. With all the hype about 3D printing, and in 2014, everybody was talking about 3D printing, I just couldn't see it. Not 3D printing in the home, really useful and interesting in business. We have a bunch of 3D printers at the office. But additive manufacturing was basically making plastic tchotchkes slowly. And there's just not a lot of plastic blobs that you want in your life. So this idea, this vision that you could create things at the push of a button was so powerful, but the actual things you could create were worthless. So I couldn't get excited about 3D printing. I tried to 3D print parts for the game, and it was like, oh yeah, here's a little, single color blobby plastic turtle. Hooray. And then I discovered CNC lasers and could cut the pieces out of different materials. And, I had there were walls in the game, and I could have these wooden walls that had stone engraved on them and looked really cool and stood up. And I could make these things in the garage in bulk really quickly, because laser technology is fast and it's much easier to design for, because you can make 2D pieces that assemble into 3D. So I used this for prototyping. And then I had this industrial carbon dioxide cutting laser imported from a factory in China, installed in my garage, and I just started playing. I kind of finished up shipping the board game and spent 6 months just making stuff. And while I was making stuff, I invited friends over from the entrepreneur world, and I was like, let me make you something. Let me show you what this can do. And they would see this thing in my garage and say, Dan, what are you doing? You've lost your mind. And I'd say, well, let me engrave your laptop for you. Let me make something. And then I'd finish, and they'd be like, okay, yeah, that was pretty cool. One of those folks who I showed it to, a guy named Rick Hennessy, I'd originally met when I was fundraising for my very first company, Ontella. At that first company, I had gone and done the whole Seattle Angel circuit and gone to all the different Seattle Angel events. And standing in the hallway waiting to pitch, I met this guy, Rick Hennessy, and I met his co-founder, Mark Goslin. Well, fast forward 10 years, and Rick's in my garage, sees this thing and says, you remember Mark? I'm like, yeah, kind of. And he says, Mark would dig this. He likes hardware. Well, they just had a $100 million exit the year before. So they were both figuring out what they wanted to do next. Had lunch with Mark, and it turned out Mark had spent the intervening year building from scratch in his garage a CNC laser cutter engraver. And I explained to him what I thought this could be, that putting this technology in people's hands is revolutionary. It's like how the personal computer pulled computing out of the data center in businesses and gave it to us on our desktops. This is like pulling factory production out of businesses and putting it on our desktops, and could have the same transformative effect on the world. That's how
cool.
Glowforge got started.
Yeah, that's cool. Interesting. And so, without getting too deep into this, let's do a short version. But what's the, you brought a laser cutter over from China and put it in your garage. What have you invented around the technology? What's the IP that you guys have added to it?
So this thing was, some rails, some motors, and really low-level software. Making this delightful and easy to use required a huge amount of innovation that, like, nobody who owns a Glowforge even knows happen. So, for example, when you turn it on, uses machine vision to calibrate itself, look where all the components are, and align itself perfectly. When you put in material, it grabs a picture of the image, de-distorts it, measures with a low power laser the distance to your material, and lets you take your image and preview it on top of the material. What you used to have to do is literally open up a laser, grab the laser head, and drag it to the corner of where it was going to start the print. Like, imagine doing this with an inkjet printer. If you wanted to print something on a piece of paper, dragging the ink cartridge into the right location with no print preview. So we actually use a camera to do all this. We use things like machine vision, so you can put in giant oversized material, start your print, and then move it through, and the camera can see how far the material is moved and continue your print and pick up where you've left off. And then a whole host of mechanical, electrical, high voltage improvements, safety improvements, all things that make it easy, inexpensive, and delightful to go put in a small package, because the industrial lasers are huge, in a home where you can run it in the background while you're having a conversation, while you're checking your email, making it really fast and easy to print. And then the cloud software that makes it all work, the really easy, simple, intuitive software. So, kindergartners can go up, create a design, and actually bring it to life with just the set of tools that they've got.
Yeah. You mentioned, like, you're in 4,000 schools. I imagine some folks are buying this for their home. What's the core market? Is it mostly hobbyists in schools, or is there an industrial component too? Or
what we've seen is that home users, creative crafters, inventors, have been one piece of it. It's really been a diverse market. Then people who want to start a business is probably the biggest segment, who are going to go take that crafting, that creating to the next level. Schools have been a huge growth area over the last 2 years, where we just sort of went from educators buying it occasionally to now over 4,000 schools who have it. And we have curriculum plans and teacher support in place so that folks can know how to go put this in schools. And it's a delight. Like, just about anybody who I run into, 50-50 chance their kids, I say Glowforge, and they're like, oh, I use a Glowforge in school, which is so rewarding and delightful to hear. And increasingly, we're seeing folks like realtors who are using this to personalize gifts, event planners who use it to create signs. It really limitless in terms of what it can do. So we have a really diverse user base.
Yeah, interesting. Great. Let's see. Where do I go? There's so many things. Let's talk about crowdfunding for a moment. For Robot Turtles, what's the secret to the success there? I guess, how much did you raise on crowdfunding, and did you have to hustle hard, or did you just basically put it up on Kickstarter and it kind of, the product did the rest for you?
It was an interesting mix, because I've spent, years and years poured into a business to try and make it work. And it wasn't that, but it was definitely not just put it up and see what happens either. I invented the game with the kids, and then had a really intense 3-month period of putting this together. And so hired people on sites like Upwork to go do the design. That was actually just to create the game, but also to create the design assets for the Kickstarter campaign. I emailed every person I've ever met or known and said, hey, look, you're going to hear from me very rarely, but I'm doing this new thing and I wanted to tell you about it. It was interesting because at its time in 2015, or no, sorry, the board game was in 2012. In 2012, Kickstarter was getting a ton of attention and it was almost newsworthy on its own. And coding for kids was still kind of new and controversial. A lot of people were like, why would you teach preschoolers programming principles, even with a board game? Like, that seems like maybe that's too soon. And so it was an interesting thing that people wanted to talk about and share. And there was nothing like it. There wasn't any non-digital activity that helped introduce kids to some of the principles of coding that didn't have a screen in front of it. When I say principles of coding, simple stuff like try a thing, and if it doesn't work, try it again, which is not a thing kids learn. Like, kids in school learn, try it and get it right. But in coding, the best way to try it is just run the code and see what it does. Try it again if that doesn't work. And so the game teaches things like that, like write a really simple program by laying cards in place. And if it doesn't do what you want it to, no penalty, just try again. And so there was a real conversation happening around that. People started posting in social media, emailing it to friends, ultimately raised about $500,000. My goal was 25, and I thought that maybe I was going to get 50, or if things really went well, it was 100. So I was really excited about that. But it was very ad hoc. I asked a lot of friends for advice and feedback. In fact, as luck would have it, one of the friends who probably gave me the most advice in coaching is a guy named Alon Lee. When I was done and had launched it, he got excited and launched a Kickstarter for a game he created called Exploding Kittens, which is now one of the largest game companies in the world. So his crowdfunding campaign for that shattered my record many times over. And then he came back and is an investor in Glowforge and helped me with the Glowforge crowdfunding campaign. So being able to call on creative folks, and I should note, like, Alon's, world-class creative, but had never done a crowdfunding campaign. So just brainstorming with smart, thoughtful people unlocked so much in terms of how to go bring that to life. And really looking back on it, I could say, it helped a lot that I had a list of people who I could go mail, but it wasn't a huge list. It was like 5,000 people, and there wasn't 5,000 people who were interested in the game. It was just 5,000 people that I'd talked to over the years. That kind of helped. I had some connections in media, but not much. And I think one or two people I knew wrote about it. Far and away, the thing that made that successful was that people were interested in it, that it was a newsworthy topic. That you say a board game for preschoolers, and people either said, I'm in, tell me more, or said, yeah, don't care. And having a polarizing idea like that, where people either lean in or lean out, is the most powerful turbocharger for anything, for financing, for customer acquisition, for you name it. Having an idea where in one sentence you can get people in or out is so powerful. And it's actually the worst thing about Glowforge, is that I can't in one sentence tell you the full majesty, like I convey what it can do. It's what's made the company really challenging, and has made it a much more interesting and challenging marketing effort over the years, because it's not an idea that sells itself. It's like, hey, here's the thing you can do that you didn't know was possible. So if there's one secret weapon you can take into any sort of financing, it's your one sentence pitch that gets people to go either yes, I'm in, or nope, I'm out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you say kind of have a polarizing idea, or even a polarizing one sentence, do you feel like you need to take whatever your one sentence is and sort of make it a little more controversial or dramatic to create that polarization? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. It is better that people are deeply excited and totally repelled than that people are mildly interested.
Sure. Yeah.
So if I'd said Robot Turtles was an educational board game for kids, I would have had fewer people interested and fewer people upset, and nobody would have paid any attention, because there's a million educational board games for kids. But saying it's a board game that teaches programming to preschoolers at a time when that wasn't really understood really got people either like, yeah, stop. Most of them would just assume it was like a digital game, and they're like, you shouldn't be showing screens to kids. And I'm like, I'm actually not. And they're like, then I don't care. Or leaning forward going like, oh my gosh, what an amazing idea. Like, let me understand this. So that's the biggest super weapon you can have. And funny thing, that one's free. So much marketing is expensive. That polarizing and powerful statement, that's free.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, I do want to make sure we talk about fundraising for Glowforge. So, you have this idea, you're showing it to your friends in Seattle there, or your startup friends, people are grooving on it. How does that go to raising? Did you raise an angel round? I know your most recent was a Series E. So let's start a little bit more towards the beginning of that story, and how'd you kind of get it off the ground and fundraise for it in the early days?
Yeah, I started with an angel round. We we started with an angel round, brought in some great investors, and added the investor base over time. But I'm gonna tell you something. When I was doing my first company, and I asked for advice, the number of people who are like, "Well, first thing you do is you call your network, then you go, call up the VCs that you know, and I'm like, what? No, that's not helpful at all." Or, people like, yeah, when you angel, invest, you got to expect that, maybe half the people you talk to are going to say no. I pitched my first company for 9 months to anything that would move with $0 raised. And I found it so frustrating when people who had success were coming in and saying like, yeah, once you're successful at fundraising, it's easy to be successful again. Like, how utterly useless. So I'm not going to do your listeners any good by being like, yeah, we pitched 26 angels and 24 of them wrote checks. Okay, that was just because I'd had experience. I had the network to do it. The hard one is your first company. The hard one is the first time you go out. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ignore your question. Forget what happened at Glowforge. Let me tell you what happened at Ontella. So after 9 months of nothing, I managed to convince one person to get involved with the company who had a tremendous reputation in Seattle. Lots of angel investors knew this person, and VC firms. He was an associate partner. I'm not associate. He was like I forget what it was called, but he was a partner at a couple of VC firms. And once he got in and said, I believe in this and I'm behind it, then we could pull together some angels. Then we pulled together our first VC investor. That was when things started to fall into place. But I pitched until I was blue in the face with nothing. And then when it came time for our Series B, I will never forget. It was January 3rd. I hit the road. This has got to be 2007, 2000, I think about that. And closed the round. I had the investor signed up and we started papering things a month later. And I was talking to our corporate attorney. He goes, Dan, you're magical. Like, how did you get the round done in a month? I said, well, I got MVP frequent flyer status on Alaska in January. I did 68 pitches, and it was the 68th pitch that wrote the check. He said, oh, okay, you just did 3 to 6 months of fundraising all in 1 month. But 68 pitches and 67 no's. Like, I was done. Well, and even then I continued to try and do, but I was pretty much at the end of my list. Like, there were only another dozen people that I could call on, and I did, and they all said no too. So it is a brutal numbers game. And I don't know, I think some of the worst advice that people get, and I realize this is controversial, some of the worst advice people get is for early stage founders to hear the advice to focus on their fundraising. Like, find the small set of firms that's a perfect fit and just really focus on closing those firms. I think that's good advice when you have a reputation, when you have experience. I think that advice is often given by people with a reputation and experience. But it is so hard to raise. It turns into a numbers game because that perfect investor, they just invested in another company in your space. They just finished investing out of their first fund and they're raising a new fund. They just had some questionable sushi that's not sitting right with them and they weren't really listening to your pitch. Like, there is always a reason why people say no. Professional VCs say no hundreds of times a year. Like, that's the ratio that you're working. And yes, a couple of times a year. So the default answer is no. And I don't know any advice for first-time entrepreneurs other than to play it as a numbers game. Yes, find the best VCs, create the right pitch, like dial it in and understand that, and then pitch 50 more people.
Yeah,
same thing applies to angel investors.
I think that's good advice. That's something I tell our customers all the time. I use my story. I pitched 200 investors to end up with 1 VC and 10 angels. And that felt like a lot, but that's what it took. So, yeah. Interesting, very interesting. And
by the way, when you're on pitch number 50, it's really easy to feel like an idiot who can't close anything. Nope, that's just the way it works. Great ideas, bad ideas, they get a lot of no's.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you said, like you found that one guy who was well connected, had a great reputation, but you had pitched till you're blue in the face. I mean, you kind of had to pitch till you're blue in the face before you got to that one guy, right?
And I'll tell you one more tidbit. I reached out to him multiple times, followed up, couldn't get a meeting, went to a conference in Barcelona. We're a wireless company, so we went to the mobile wireless conference in Barcelona, tracked him down, staked out a bar where I knew that there was an event, and then happened to run into him and said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, like all the way from Seattle, fancy meeting you here," and got the meeting.
Had he, I have to ask, did he like know who you were, or was he like,
Yeah,
was
he
there
kind of
something
remembered. He's
this
like,
is the
"Oh
guy
yeah,
that's
we
bugged
were."
me 12 times, or
Yeah,
did
he was
he?
like, "Oh yeah, whatever." But suddenly I was there in the flesh, and I wasn't, a squeaking leech. I was like a normal, decent person who was having an interesting conversation. And he was like, "Oh, great, okay, yeah, let we chat a little bit." And he's like, "That sounds neat. Let's talk when we're in Seattle." So,
Yeah, that's funny.
and
So
by the
if you
way,
want to touch a
he
little bit
was.
more on Glowforge's, oh, go ahead, please.
I also just have to say he was a dyed-in-the-wool sales guy. So years later, when we laughed about that, he was like, "And good on you." Like that was exactly the way. That was exactly the way you should have done it.
He liked your chutzpah or whatever,
It
your determination.
he didn't find out quite how contrived that random chance meeting was until a year or so later. But when he did, he thought that was on point.
Yeah, I like it. That's good. And I'm glad we're returning to like in-person events, because I find that to be pretty valuable, right? The cocktail party after SaaStr or whatever it is a great time to meet folks, and it's great if you can identify, oh, I'm trying to get to know that person, and then go up and bring them a beer or something. But it's much more relaxed.
Yeah, I mean that 9 months of first fundraising was going to every event that I could possibly find. And you know what? Here's my experience with those events is that people expect that it's like a love at first sight. You go up, you're like, "Hey, you're so and so. I got a pitch. That never works." But they do start threads that you can pull on. And so you go up and you just have a social conversation with the person, chat with them a little bit, and we're going to start up, and here's the one line pitch. Love to share it with you sometime. And then, then you follow up with the meeting and so on, because especially for investors, they do tend to get pigeonholed, and people jump on them and try to give them the pitch there. And it's not the right place for the hard sell. It's the right place to start the conversation. And then you find some time later to go pull that forward. And there are people I met at those early networking events who never invested, or so who didn't invest, but who came back months later, who came back years later for different companies. And ultimately the relationships got built out of that. Just remember that to your listeners, just remember those sorts of things. They're not transactional. It's not a pitch meeting where you come out with a yes or no. It's a chance to start a connection that you can build on over time.
So we get into the weeds on this show, so I'm going to get into the weeds on that a little bit. Let's say you meet not the guy at the bar, but let's see, you meet an investor at an event. You give him your one-liner, but you're not trying to present your full 3-minute elevator pitch or 5-minute pitch, whatever. You're having a conversation, and then how do you sort of table it for an action item as a follow-up, or any tips on that?
If I'm running into an investor at a social event and my secret or ulterior motive is I want them as an investor, then I'm going to start the conversation, and I might say to her, "Oh, you're working on this thing. That's so cool. Can you tell me about it? Like, I just heard you invested in this company." And I mean, if you need to, you can sort of like see the person, step out, Google them, look for the latest news article about them, be like, "Oh, great," and be like, "Hey, I read in the news that you just invested in so and so. That's really cool. How did you get connected with that company?" Have a nice conversation, and at some point, if they're not completely like trying to focus on something else, they'll probably ask you something about you. "Oh yeah, I'm working on a company. We're making a 3D laser printer. Actually creates anything you can imagine at the push of a button. It's really cool." And then they say, "Oh, well, that sounds kind of neat. I'd love to show it to you sometime. Can I get your email and follow up?" Great. "Oh man, look at the crackers on the table. Don't those look great? Change back to something innocuous." And you come off looking like a human being instead of a pitch bot, which is always a win. And so that, make some sort of human connection and share honestly what you're excited about, and then, finish up as a human being. That's a good way to actually maximize your chance of building a relationship with a person, which is what you're really there to do, rather than to, pull out the checkbook and get that delivered.
I love that. That's great. That's super good. And then you would go back, follow up an email, and try and arrange maybe a little bit more of a formal chat.
Yeah, like what I usually use is the demo. Whatever the product is, I'm like, hey, I would actually love to show you the product and get your feedback on it. We're looking for investors, and I'd love to have that discussion as well. But the number one thing I want from you is your feedback on the product we're working on. And that gives them the air cover to be able to say yes to the meeting, without feeling like, if you put somebody under the gun, like, I'm looking for investment right now, there's a million reasons to say no. And so there's a good chance that if you're not a perfect fit, they're going to go look for one. But if you say, I'd like your advice and feedback, and I want to show this to you, then if you're not a perfect fit, there's a good reason to say yes, because they can look at it. And if, still give you the advice you asked for, and they're networking too. Investors are all about having relationships with promising entrepreneurs at all different stages. So by making it not a must be yes or no, you're actually making it easier for them to engage and fall in love with what you're doing and fall in love with the business and idea. Then if you say, let's do it, I'm going to pitch you, come on in, checkbook on the table, let's do it.
Interesting. Yeah, I like it. What, you're on Series 8E. How much total have you raised? And then maybe any specific tips for raising for hardware, which I think is its own kind of unique animal.
Yeah, we've raised over $100 million at this point, and hardware is really difficult, particularly right now. There was a time that, we took full advantage of, from like 2015 to 2018, when hardware was thereabouts, when hardware was really in vogue. There are a bunch of investors who specialized in it, investors who didn't, were willing to write checks, but there were a lot of bankruptcies. I was talking to one of our manufacturing partners, and they said that they started working with about 100 startups in 2014, 2015. And of those, we were the only one that wasn't sold or insolvent. And that burned a lot of goodwill. So there are not a lot of investors who do hardware. We're really fortunate. Foundry Group, True Ventures, who led our Series A, are some of the foremost hardware investors. MakerBot, Fitbit, Peloton, companies like that. So they know how it's done, and they're not afraid of the ups and downs. But hardware is really specialized. You kind of have to find firms that really focus on that. Bolt is another firm that does that, does really great work there. And there's a few of them. But it's specialized and it's tricky. So it is one of the, well, I'm biased. I think it's one of the most difficult areas to fundraise for, particularly for new companies. And it really does require that you have something more than just sell the hardware and walk away. There's a reason that every hardware company has some recurring component of their business models, because it's really hard to make it work with a one-time, one and done hardware sale. Really difficult to compete with companies that can just burn you down on margin and cost and knock off the core idea.
What's your recurring revenue for Glowforge?
So if you buy your Glowforge, you are set. You can go and it just uses electrons, and you can engrave and carve all sorts of things. But most of our customers find that the materials that we sell are just an order of magnitude better. They're actually digitally encoded, so they're recognized by the machine. You put them in there and it's like, walnut hardwood. We've configured all the settings for you, so you don't have to do any settings or dial in. They are sanded, and the wood products are sanded. They have a furniture grade UV catalyzed finish applied to them, so you take them out and they're ready to use. The protective coating, so you don't have to sand them afterwards. So they save a ton of time. We also have a software service at $20 a month that adds a ton of functionality, 3 million images, thousands of designs, unlimited storage, creative tools and the like, that really just make it so much easier to create things. So those really give us a balanced life cycle. And there's an unseen benefit When you're building a hardware product and then sending it off on its merry way, never to talk to the customer again, you don't actually really have an incentive to make a great product. Whereas if we're not innovating and improving every single day, then we lose our relationship with those customers and the revenue that comes with it. I'm a big believer that companies do what they're financially incentivized to do. So if your financial incentives are a recurring revenue relationship with the customer, then you are really strongly incentivized to do great stuff for your customers all the time so you don't lose that. I think it makes us a better company.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, couple more quickies, then I'll let you go. Going back to your book, we'll plug it again. Hot Seat Startup CEO Guidebook. I'm assuming it's available on Amazon and all the usual places.
Yep.
On the back, you have a question: why is it a mistake to ask for investor intros? You want to talk about?
The wording of that is important. It's, why is it a mistake to ask for introductions to investors? And the reason is because people do this all the time. Do you know any investors? It's like, I remember going into like college and asking somebody, I remember some freshman came up and said, do you know any girls? Imagine somebody did that. You'd be like, what are you talking about? That's a ridiculous thing to ask. People are different. Everybody's different. And so if you go up to somebody and say, do you know any investors? The most generous thing you're going to get is like, well, tell me a little bit about your company and what you're doing and who you're looking for. What you want to do, if you're talking to somebody who's well-connected, is you are the one who needs to do the homework. So you say, I am founding a hardware company. I'm looking for investors who really understand hardware. I know there's these 4 firms that I'm trying to meet. I know these 2 investors in town are doing this. Do you have any connections to those folks or anybody else who's really passionate around hardware? That's a great question. Somebody comes to me with that. I'm now thinking about how I can help them because they've teed up the problem. Somebody comes up and says, do you know any investors? I'm like, yeah, lots, but you're not doing the work. So why would I risk my credibility and my relationships connecting them to you when you couldn't even be bothered to help me figure out what it is you need? So you don't ask for introductions to investors. You ask for introductions to the specific people and kinds of people that it is that you need to meet to make your business successful.
Yeah, amen, brother. I love that because I give a talk called Funding Hacks, and that's actually my opening monologue. Is, how do founders screw this up? They say, do you know any investors? It's the same exact thing, and that's way too ambiguous, too vague. If you don't know what you're looking for, how can I help you? You've got to do the homework of figuring out the right investors, and then ask me. I see you're connected to Dan. Can you connect me to Dan because he does this, and I want to get to know him, right? Like, you've done the homework.
And by the way,
yeah.
Here's a ghostwritten email. Feel free to use it if you'd like, or here's an email I'm going to send you that you can forward to him. Like, make it super easy.
Yeah, good. And then one other from the back of your book, and then I'll let you go. The question was, I think, when do you play the CEO card? That's an intriguing question.
Yeah, I struggle with that one every single day. So the book is about the role of the CEO at a startup, particularly during the founding stage, the earliest stage, but all the way through to how you sell a company. And at every step of the way, you're going to find, like, if you have advisors, if you have a board, then no matter what you do, you will either get the feedback that says, as the CEO, you should be involved in this, you should understand this, you should overrule those bad decisions and fix this. Or you'll get the decision of, you are micromanaging, you are being too involved, you need to hire good people and let them do their work. Some days you get both pieces of feedback at the same time. So as a CEO, you get to play the CEO card, which is, I'm the CEO, you got to do it. Question is, when do you do that? Because the more you do, the more you undermine the ability of the organization to do its job. And the short answer is, the places where you need to be ready to play the CEO card are hiring, firing, fundraising, the highest level company strategy, and exit. And everywhere else, you want to do your best to take 5 steps back and use your role as CEO as advisor rather than autocrat. And, if any of my employees are listening, they'll be like, okay, Dan, take thine own counsel. This is something I struggle with all the time. But ultimately, it is how you play the CEO card is really what defines you as a leader in the company that you build.
That's interesting. Interesting. So we'll leave that as a plug. If people want to delve into that more, pick up the book. This is great. Glowforge.com, right?
Glowforge.com and twitter.com/Dan Shapiro if you want to follow up with me.
Beautiful. Great. Anything you want to promote or plug, or any final parting words of wisdom?
I would just say, having been there, raising for my first company, been there so many times, the greatest piece of the struggle is that everybody's mostly failing all the time, but you only hear about it when people succeed.
Yeah.
So seek out those stories, seek out the counsel, not from people who are having great success. Seek out the counsel of those who've been there before and ask about those times. Ask about the failed round, ask about the company that petered out, ask about the co-founder relationships that didn't work. Set aside your pride, because everybody is going through that misery. And honestly, one of the greatest things about writing that book was getting to hear those stories and write them down so that people would know they're not alone. It's the path most of us walk when we're founding a company. It is difficult, it is painful, and if all goes well, it is rewarding like nothing else in the working world.
I love it. Great note to end on. All right. Thank you, Dan. Glowforge.com. Check it out. And this is awesome. We'll catch you on company number 5, whatever that may be. So
I think this might be my life's work, but thank you so much, Nathan. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Over and out. Thank you.
Bye-bye.